We today are talking about 3 studies around professional development, and I know it's something you've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about.
You know, I think a big part of being able to improve is actually having the cognitive headspace to improve.
So why do you think there's such improvement after 3 or 4 years before that rate of improvement slows down?
A lot of professional development involves some kind of knowledge building.
How do we get people into a headspace where they want to receive feedback and they're open to it?
I think if you are a teacher or you work with new teachers, you see how difficult it is to be a teacher.
Are you looking for brilliant CPD that is inspiring, illuminating and impactful? Well, Inner Drive's training is evidence-informed, engaging and makes a real difference. Whether it is in person at your training days or online through our Teachers CPD Academy, Inner Drive is transforming how schools and colleges do professional development. Email us at info@innerdrive.co.uk to take your staff training to the next level.
Hello and welcome to Inner Drive's Science of Learning podcast with me, Bradley Bush. The podcast where we discuss the latest and indeed greatest cognitive science and educational research. Because we believe there's absolute gold in the research, and if we can make it accessible and put in front of the right people, i.e. you, our lovely listeners, and even lovelier subscribers, it can be transformational in the lives of students. Now in each episode we're going to discuss 3 studies. Some are seminal, some are recent, all are illuminating. When we uncover a key cognitive science principle, you will hear the principle ping. And when we discuss the nuance of application, you will hear the nuance noise, which today sounds a bit like this. Today, I'm joined by the one and only Sarah Cottinghatt. Sarah, welcome to the pod.
Thank you for having me. Very happy to be here.
Thank you for joining me. We today are talking about 3 studies around professional development. And I know it's something you've spent a lot of time thinking about and writing about. So I have about 1,000,001 questions to ask you. But we'll go through the 3 studies and see which questions we get through.
Mm-hmm.
So if it's all right with you, I thought we'd just jump straight in.
Yeah, let's do it.
Okay, so study number 1, for me, I chose this study because I think it's probably the seminal study in terms of teacher development and improvement. It's probably one of the most cited, I think. I see it in a lot of presentations. Study by Kraft and Pape in 2014. And so essentially what they did in this study is they tracked the rate of improvement in teachers over the course of their career, like over the first 10 years or so, and wanted to see what's the rate of improvement and what kind of makes a difference in that. And 2 main findings stood out for me, and I just want to kind of get your thoughts on it. So the first one was, on average, the rate of improvement in the first 3 years is huge. It's really rapid, really steep improvement. After about 3 or 4 years, there is still some improvement, but the rate of improvement declines a lot, almost to like a plateau after a while. And so I just wanted to ask, I guess, both from your experience in the classroom, but also with your work with teachers, why do you think that tends to be the case? Why do you think there's such improvement after 3 or 4 years before that rate of improvement slows down?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think if you are a teacher or you work with new teachers, you see how difficult it is to be a teacher. And that the kind of rate of growth, that really steep kind of rate of growth that you described, is that kind of sink or swim.
Right.
That you really have to learn quickly. We also see that, unfortunately, a lot of teachers leave the profession quite early on. But if you do stay, and that I think that graph's kind of up to like 10 years.
Yeah.
If you do stay, you've often made that very steep improvement very quickly, and it's just not one of those professions where like you can afford to kind of take your time at getting better. There's so much to learn so quickly. When I worked with brand new teachers at Teach First, for example, it was just really evident how quickly they had to get to the point where they could like manage the classroom, you know, effectively communicate their subject, etc., etc.
Is that kind of sink or swim? Is that a problem for us in this space? Because sink or swim means like, well, a lot of people are going to sink and then we're going to lose a lot of brilliant people. I imagine it's the same in all other professions as well. So I guess the question probably is like, what can schools and school leaders do to make sure those first 3 years, there's still this improvement, but it shouldn't be at like a do or die type knife edge and cost to people's like well-being essentially.
Yeah, definitely. I think it is a massive problem in the teaching profession. And I think it's possibly like such a big problem, or perhaps historically been such a big problem, because we were very late to be able to say kind of what makes a good teacher, and what that looks like, and to codify that and be able to train people properly. You know, if you become a pilot, for example, another quite like high stakes, mind the pun,
Quite
kind of
high
profession.
stakes. Yeah, good pun as well, though. Eh? Like that.
Then you have like a very strict kind of like training regime, and your qualifications for certain things get refreshed every year, and they know what makes you good at your job. Whereas I think for a long time, and perhaps still in some areas, it's very difficult to codify like what makes great teaching. And that kind of led to people thinking like some teachers have got it and some teachers haven't, that kind of sink or swim. But I think we're moving, and we'll talk about other studies as well, but particularly with the Craft and Prepare study that you've kind of just talked about, that kind of rate of growth that slows but continues for some teachers in some schools is indicating things like having collaborative, very good professional development, helping you continue to improve.
Yeah.
And that kind of environment, if you can kind of bake that in from the very start, is going to help more teachers swim than sink.
Yeah. And so kind of building on that, the second part, or their second main finding was, so you have this average pattern of steep improvement and then it slows down after like year 3 or 4. They looked at what they call supportive environments, and they found that teachers who are part of a supportive environment over like 10 years, I think it was like 38 or 39% difference in terms of like improvements made if you're part of a supportive environment. And it's really interesting. So when I was looking at the study, I was like, I wonder what they term, what kind of do you have to be part of that makes it supportive? So they were the kind of subsections of things that create a supportive environment. I thought I'd read them out to you and see which ones kind of stood out for you of interest. So what counts as a supportive environment included order and discipline, peer collaboration, good leadership, professional development, school culture, and teacher evaluation. Maybe we can talk about a few of them in turn. Any that particularly stood out for you that you think might be more important or more interesting?
Yeah, I mean, it's good to caveat first of all though that it was like, as we know, like correlation rather than causation, and they looked at schools in one particular district and things like that. But like you say, still very widely cited kind of study. And I think partly because the things you've listed there are like not that surprising.
Right, it'd be weird if they weren't on the list.
Yeah. So the behaviour one, for example, I think like a lot of listeners will be like, you know, when they've perhaps gone to work at a school where behaviour's like not such an issue, and they've felt that it's just more manageable, and they can concentrate on other things as well. And then you tie that in with this like kind of good supportive leadership aspect of it. And again, like listeners will be nodding along. Like if you've got kind of behaviour where and you know, a really supportive leadership team, and like they're developing you in a really good way through strong and collaborative professional development, then you can see that you're onto this real winning recipe where you know, I think a big part of being able to improve is actually having the cognitive headspace to improve. And in some environments, you're so exhausted by all the other things that you just can't engage.
I guess if you're always feeling like you're spinning plates,
Yeah.
like you don't have the headspace to think about what am I doing well, what could I do better? It's just constant firefighting, essentially.
Exactly, yeah. Where's the kind of cognitive capacity to engage and actually improving? And you also have to feel that it's possible for you to improve. So if leadership are not kind of supportive, or you don't perceive them to be supportive, what's the point in your efforts anyway? Yeah. So it kind of, when like you look at those factors that kind of come together, it's brilliant that they've been identified, because it really shows that it's not just up to the teacher. It's not about like, well, you know, Sarah's not a teacher that really can get better. It's not a kind of trait thing. It's actually like in large part the environment that you're in that's going to be whether you are one of those teachers that plateaus or one of those teachers that can continue to improve.
So let me ask you one question out of all those sort of like bullet points on that list. The one that I find fascinating. So obviously professional development, given what we do at Inner Drive, you'd expect our eyes to naturally be drawn to that. I think good, high quality CPD, you'd expect that to make people get better if you can nail that. But let's take that as a given. The one I thought was interesting and maybe more challenging is their last one, where they talk about teacher evaluation. And in the paper, what they mean by that is they talk about meaningful feedback. So not so much evaluation like a judgment, but like feedback on how to improve. And I've had a few people fairly recently ask me, what does the research suggest around feedback? We know what it says about how teachers give it to students. So we look at research around feedback about the process as opposed to the person, or not focusing just on the outcome, like your grade, essentially. What's been your experience around feedback with teachers? Because on one hand, feedback, if delivered badly, it can be seen as an attack and a criticism. But on the other hand, if we get it right, it can be this really powerful tool. So like, what's been your experience either within coaching or beyond that, around how do we get people into a headspace where they want to receive feedback and they're open to it?
Yeah, it's a really good question. Feedback is like a funny one. It's one of these things which I think is like, we have to call it something, i.e. feedback, but we're lumping so much stuff in with it. And it's not detached from the environment, like you're saying. You know, it's the way that feedback lands and what feedback's about is very much tied to kind of what's going on in the school at the time. So if you feel like the feedback you're being given is on something you were never trained on and something that you weren't told you were ever going to be evaluated on, or you think it's like the person's personal preference that comes into the classroom. This is something very dear to me, because when I was teaching, especially in my first school, it felt like it was just the person coming in and what they liked to see. And I think people have had this experience. Then feedback, it becomes quite meaningless. It ends up all being very performative and feels very like high stakes and unfair. Like there's no rubric behind this feedback. There's no way that I could have known how to do well in this situation. But I think feedback in the environment described in the paper, in these schools that are doing all of these other things as well, you can see why feedback would be supportive and not this kind of high stakes thing, but this like goal that we're all working towards. And it's very obvious that we are all working towards it. And I was just listening to this podcast the other day about schools in Mississippi who they've seen like quite extraordinary gains in reading for their
big improvements there, right?
Yeah, really big improvements. And partly it's because, partly they put it down to having these like literacy coaches kind of go into the school, and the district have kind of provided these literacy coaches, and they're giving this kind of real-time feedback in classrooms, which the teachers seem to be like really lapping up. And you think about everything that's going on in those environments, like they're teaching kids who really need to learn to read. We know what happens when kids don't learn to read. They know it's really important. They know that they need to get better at it, and perhaps historically haven't been supported to get better at it. So they share in that goal. The school is bought in, so leadership are bought in, and these people are kind of, they're not coming in to evaluate the teachers. The feedback doesn't become this big high stakes kind of thing, but it does form part of their evaluation, and they are tracked on how much they support their kids to read through kind of like test scores and stuff like that. But they're okay with it. So they're okay with it because they're part of an environment like the one that is the ones that are described in this paper, I think.
And I think if I look at where things have shifted in England over the last 10 or 15 years, moving away from one-off graded lesson observations, which isn't the norm in other parts of the world where we work in. So I think we are kind of a bit more at the forefront of that than some other countries. I think it's made people more open to feedback because it's just separated the judgment side of it from the how do we all get better at this thing that's really important.
Yeah, I think so. I think you're right. And I think kind of, again, like feedback exists in a space, doesn't it? And if you are aspiring, so something we're using more in schools in this country is like models of great teaching. So if you know what you're aspiring to, feedback becomes more useful, more meaningful.
Yeah, let's definitely talk a bit more about that models, because that's definitely come up in study 3. Why don't we move on to the next one, which is study 2. So I asked you, what study within this topic would you really like to talk about or think people should know about? Why don't you talk us through study 2?
Is that our Sims et al?
That's your Sims et al study.
So a few years ago now, the EEF wanted to kind of write one of their kind of brilliant papers on essentially like what makes effective professional development. And there were a few kind of papers floating around at the time that were kind of looking at professional development and like one sort of programs that work, and then looking at what those programs contain. Yeah. And the problem with that is that they might contain things that they just contain, because it's like useful, like collaboration, for example, because it has to be that way, and not because they're necessarily mechanisms. So things that drive the program to be effective.
Yeah.
And by effective, we mean like change teachers' practice, which is hard because teaching's hard and we form these strong habits, and filters down to student outcomes as well. So this study, Sims et al, is a study which I was lucky enough to be kind of a part of in a kind of small way. And they basically pre-registered a framework of like, we think these things make professional development work. These are the mechanisms. And then they looked at over 100 high quality randomized control trial studies on professional development, and their framework lived or died by these studies. It wasn't like, we'll look at it and then we'll come up with our framework. It was like, we've pre-registered the framework, so we could be wrong. So it's quite a high stakes and a really good thing to do from a kind of research perspective. And what was kind of found was that these mechanisms did indeed sort of hold up, essentially.
So go on, talk us through what were the mechanisms?
So there are 14 of them. I'm not sure I can remember all of them off the top of my head, but luckily I've written them down. But they essentially fell into like 4 kind of purposes of professional development. And that's like a good place to start if you're interested in this study, and you can go to the EEF and kind of like look it up and see lovely posters and pictures of this as well, which are really easy to digest.
Lots of cogs turning in the picture.
Lots of cogs, yeah. I think Ambition Institute have done an even nicer, diagram of this. But essentially 4 purposes. So the EF talk about kind of building knowledge as the first purpose. And like a lot of professional development involves some kind of knowledge building. Yeah. So, if we're training teachers on phonics instruction, like what is phonics? What's the difference between a kind of phonics and another approach to teaching, reading, etc. So it's like there's a knowledge building element. Sometimes PD used to stop there. Yeah. But actually there's more purposes than that. So the next one is around motivating goals. So a teacher has to have the knowledge and they have to have goals within that area. So things that they kind of want to achieve. They have to be able to set goals and kind of know where they're heading, essentially. And then we've come to the kind of instruction layer. So then they need support with actually like understanding what they're supposed to do in the classroom about this. Yeah. They shouldn't be kind of left to wonder. So that involves, explicitly teaching them the instructional strategy, rehearsing it for them to see high quality models that they decompose, for example. And then you might think, oh, that stops there. They've got the knowledge, they've got their goal, they now know what to do. But actually, what Sims et al tells us is there's another layer as well. And that's about like that ongoing practice that they need to do in their context that enables them to form this new habit, essentially. And there is a kind of like layer of mechanisms there as well.
So I find the last one particularly interesting, this idea of like ongoing embedding, so important. So when I read this study, so the random thing that came to mind, I don't know if you've ever heard of Batman moments, right? So a Batman moment is, so Bruce Wayne, as a youngster, saw his parents be killed, and it was like this moment that's like fork in the road, and if it wasn't for that event, he wouldn't have eventually become Batman. Kind of like your Eureka, Archimedes, like you have this one moment of insight and then the world is different forever. And those things are kind of like really like romantic, if you like, but I just don't think that's how professional development ever works. Like, yes, you and I can probably remember a session that someone said something that has stayed with us, but by and large, one-off change, like one-off events doesn't lead to long-term change. And like the C in CPD, the continuous part, that's like, I think the part that often gets overlooked. So it was really interesting that was explicitly kind of took this embedding thing was like put front and center within this paper.
Yeah.
I thought,
Yeah, I love that about like it's not a Batman moment. Yeah, it is very rarely in life, I guess. Like those kind of things are very rare when we actually want to make a change in our lives. We've got to stick at it, haven't we?
Right. So the reason I call it like a Batman moment, because my other example, which is probably like trickier, is I don't know if you ever used to watch the terrible TV show Wife Swap.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, so like, you know, like couples would like a husband would like go to a different household, and then basically you see how like different people do things, and then there was we went back 3 weeks after the show, and it's like all the time people have just reverted back to what happened before the show. So they leave the show thinking they're going to have this great moment of insight, and it's going to change their life. Yeah, and for the most part, it doesn't, because like you don't get that embedding. But I thought Batman moments is probably better than Wife Swap. Moments essentially.
It kind of reminds me of something that EBE kind of say. They I think I read in one of their papers like inspire and forget, and how a lot of professional development is inspire and forget. Yeah. But then when you go more fundamental than that, it becomes kind of, you can like apply loads of cognitive reasons to it. So habits is one. Yeah. Like we're in these really strong habits, just like the wife swap example there. You go back to the context that you're in, and all those habits are triggered again by the environment. Yeah. So you're not going to replace them by a small thing you might have tried in a one CPD session. But the other reason might be transfer as well. Even if you've rehearsed in a empty classroom with your coach, which is a really good thing to do, like the transfer might be like really far for when you get into your own classroom with the kids in front of you.
So how do you get over that transfer problem then?
Well, that's the final layer. Right. So the final layer is not just about go and try it in your classroom. Yeah. There's things like self-monitoring. So it's about like it's about the coach supporting you to know what to look for. Yeah. And to be ready to look for the signs that this is working in your classroom and how you might adjust otherwise. You're essentially planning for lots of different eventualities. Right. You're planning to embed it in a new context. You're not just taking it for granted that I rehearsed it in an empty classroom with my coach means that I can do it. It's a bit like when we teach kids, right? So we can teach them in the classroom about a particular topic, get them to write about it. And then when it comes to the exam, it's just that transfer too far. So what we try to do is get them to practice in timed conditions and try to like limit that transfer as much as possible.
And I imagine the big elephant in the room is probably time. Like you can see why people fall into the trap of just thinking it's a one-off thing, because you can tick that box, you can say you've done it, and then you can go straight back to firefighting. Whereas this has to be baked in time throughout the year, as opposed to just inset days. Yeah. Yeah. So the other thing I thought was interesting, they took, as well as the 4 mechanisms, you then said they looked at these 100 studies to see, how well do they map out. And my reading of it was they found generally the more mechanisms that a program has, the more likely it is of having a positive impact. Is that the correct reading of it?
Yeah, so I think that was quite a sort of a tentative one. Yeah. But essentially it looked as if the more mechanisms, the better, basically, yeah.
And as well as covering different mechanisms.
Yeah, so those 4 purposes I talked about, they called it like a balanced design. Yeah. So essentially, if you think about it, it kind of makes sense. Like you need to have a mechanism or more from build knowledge, goal setting, instruction, and the embedding.
So essentially one of each.
Sit in one.
Yeah, one of each would be better than just 4 in the build knowledge.
Correct.
Basically,
yeah.
Which I think is really nice, because I guess this sort of paper, it just makes it quite tangible for people designing professional development within their school or college. You can then do a bit of a self-audit of, how well do we think we're doing these 4 different purposes, and it can just help with a bit of critical thinking and planning around PD.
Yeah, I think you're right. Like there has to be a kind of utility to these kind of things, and that was really crucial. And the EEF, like quite rightly, sort of pushed for that. And I think there is that. What could happen is it becomes a little bit of a tick box. So what the thing is to understand that it's about doing the mechanism well. And that becomes a kind of slightly harder
But I mean, I think that's
but
true in everything in education.
it
So you
is,
take
yeah.
something like Rosenshine's principles,
yeah,
that could become a
absolutely.
tick box,
yeah.
but it's about doing it well.
It is. It's that Bananarama principle, isn't it? It's not what you do, it's the way that you do it. Or it's what you do and the way that you do it, which I think
Even
some
better.
people say. Yeah.
Okay, anything else you want to tell the lovely listeners on this study before we move on to study 3?
No, just that I think it's a good one. I think like the good thing about it is that the researchers are all kind of open to this being like a starting point, and actually more mechanisms might come into play as well in future studies. So it's kind of useful for what it is right now, and also open to sort of change as well.
Yeah, nice. So let's move on to study number 3.
Mm-hmm.
Before I talk about study number 3, I was actually inspired to choose this one, actually based on a different study that you first introduced me to. So I'll talk about that study briefly first as like I'll set in the scene. So you told me of a study where they had teachers watch footage of a classroom, and you basically had to see what stood out to you and what you thought might happen or what might be the most relevant information. And they found novice teachers, which I think in that study was like less than 5 years of teaching, saw very different things to those who were more experienced. The more experienced teachers not only spotted not so much more things, but like more relevant things, and how they were looking for things was the kind of less of a scattergun approach. Essentially, they probably had a schema, like a view in place of like what is going to be important, so therefore it helped them focus on those things. And I think that was the first time I really came across this idea of what the researchers call professional vision, which I think is a really, really lovely phrase. And so professional vision essentially is your ability to spot, notice, analyze, predict, suggest alternative things that you could do. Would you say that's a fair description of professional vision?
Yeah. I think it's quite a broad phrase that's sort of been like operationalized in different ways. I think that when they talk about classroom management, they talk about like with itness, and like that's kind of a sort of subset of it. But yeah, broadly speaking, yeah.
Okay, so you got this idea of professional vision, which is your ability to basically really tune in on what's happening in the classroom. And so this study, the reason I chose this study is it looked at, well, how do we then improve that? And what can we do in professional development to improve that? So it's a really recent study by Tucholka and Gold in 2025. Fairly large scale. They had about 280 participants. And essentially they used video modelling. So teachers could see clips of classroom footage. Some of the teachers learned about the theory before seeing the video. Some didn't. Some looked at essentially examples and non-examples of like, this is a good entry to the classroom. This is a clip of where the entry led to some quite bad behaviour. And they basically wanted to see, could video modelling help? And so overall, they found that significantly it did. So teachers watching classroom footage, the quote here, participants identified more relevant events, interpreted these events more elaborately, evaluated them in higher agreement with experts, and generated more alternative course of actions. So it seems like a really kind of positive finding. And we are in a drive. We think the video modelling thing is interesting. We've got a relationship with Teach Like a Champion and Doug Lemov with our Teaching Unpacked series, where he analyses classroom footage, which for me is really interesting because it's not just the footage that's interesting. It's often his analysis that accompanies it. So I could watch that clip and I don't know what I'm looking for. So having someone being able to facilitate your professional vision and also share theirs, I think is really powerful. And so I want to include this study because I think videos are becoming more prevalent as a form of PD. But I particularly wanted to discuss it with you because I want to get your take. Because I know you do use of videos, not only in the example, for example, that I gave with Doug for classroom footage, but you use it with coaching as well. So yeah, what's your general sense of like, why did you why do you use it with coaches quite a lot, and how's your experience been using the use of video footage?
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think you be interesting to see whether my take matches your take as
Okay,
well.
go.
So yes, Adam Colbeck and I use model videos of coaching on our Substack, our coaching, cognitive coaching cuts Substack, to show kind of model videos of coaching happening.
Yeah.
And like, he would send me him coaching on a video, and I would kind of joyfully watch these amazing coaching conversations. But I'd only ever be able to find a few clips that we could actually use. And the reason wasn't because I wasn't looking at something that was a very, strong model of coaching. It's just there's a difference between someone doing something well and someone doing something in a way that you can explain and show easily.
Yeah.
And I think that's the same with teaching, and quite a lot of things, really. So I think video is really powerful because you get to show someone what they're aiming for, show someone what you mean in a really concrete way.
Yeah.
But it has to be a really simplified way if they're new to it.
Yeah.
And it's not, when experts are coaching or experts are teaching, it's not simple. There's loads of like hidden layers behind what's happening that you don't want to overload them by explaining it all.
Yeah.
So it's like it's quite difficult from that perspective. And just one more thing on that, like I had the privilege of doing a project with Step Lab, where we were filming great coaching in schools, and like I was filming excellent coaches, and I had the same issue where I was kind of asking them to use specific words so that even though they'd kind of graduated beyond those words, but just because they were simpler, that I could pick out and show a more like coaches who were training essentially, so they could see what was going on in the videos a lot easier. So I think there's a tension between great model videos and your ability to analyse them for somebody, which is crucial, but in a way that doesn't overload them. I'd like to know whether you've had the same thing.
So if I lean on, like, because this study actually tried to answer that a bit as well. And when I was reading it, at first I found it quite complicated because they didn't give a clear-cut answer, essentially. And I think probably research never does, and it always gives you more questions than answers. So like two of their findings, which kind of talk to this, is they looked at, if you look at the theory first and then watch a video. So for example, let me tell you about the theory around retrieval practice or interleaving or cold calling, whatever the thing is. I'll tell you a bit about the theory and then you get to watch the clip. They found that improved how well teachers evaluated the video footage that they were watching. The researchers suggest that helped because it helped sharpen their focus. They kind of knew what to look for. If I don't know any of the theory, if I don't know the why behind it, essentially there's a lot of noise and I'm trying to, like, the scattergun approach, trying to work out where to look. So I thought that sounded really good. There were some situations where doing the theory first didn't always help. One thing I thought they did that was interesting is having contrasting videos. They said helped teachers come up with more alternative theories, which I think would be really good for decision making, for example, because essentially you've got this example or non-example. So I don't know exactly where I stand on how best to use them. I think they're really important because I think for the most part, teaching's quite an individual sport. Like quite often you're the only adult in the room. And so therefore being able to see other people and high quality examples, I think that is quite powerful. I'm pretty convinced it's more the discussion around it as opposed to the video itself. So to give you an example, let's say we put up a clip we've got some lovely clips of cold calling on our site. But what's really interesting is when staff then get together and go, here's how I do it differently and why. Here's why I wouldn't do it exactly like in that clip. I'd probably add this step or I'd take that step away. I think that's the secret sauce more than the video itself. The video is just the stimulus, but it's actually, the thing that drives change the collaboration and the discussion beyond it. So that's probably my take, I think, on how to use videos. in your experience, so you mentioned about coaching, in terms of teaching, learning, seeing other people coach. So you don't just watch your own clips, but you see other people. Are there, if any school is looking to do more to like use their videos more effectively, do you have any recommendations for them on, you know, what might be a good starting point, or even if they've been doing it for a long time, here's a bit more nuance or something that you can to get the most out of it? Any suggestions?
Yeah, it's a good question. I think what you said around like having time and space to kind of unpick what you're seeing, and presenting it perhaps not as like the one and only way you can do this, but like here's a kind of clean example within a, you know, this is a clean example of what we mean by the technique, and then perhaps layering on like when it might be appropriate in different ways. The difficulty is always like what are you trying to get someone to see, and like who are they and where are they in their expertise with this? So if you're like working with a brand new teacher and you tried to be really nuanced around like when a technique should be used and you show it in a video, you're probably going to make it so they're just completely confused by like, is this a good technique to use? Is it not a good technique? So sometimes we do need to say like, we'd like you to have this as part of your repertoire. Here's a video of someone doing it. Let's just break down what they're doing and practice it. And then we can later come back to, and how are we flexible with this? But with more experienced teachers, we may be able to kind of add that in kind of sooner. And I think this sort of goes back to sort of fundamental principles around instruction. Like if we want someone to understand what something is, it's very useful to also show them what something isn't. So like having those contrasting things is useful, and like video follows that same rule by all accounts. So yeah.
So I've got two final quick questions for you with regards to video footage. So the first one, just to get your sense of if you've seen this in action or not. When I was talking to Doug a while ago, because he does some work in sport, as we do as well, and they use a lot of video footage there. So he was saying one of the things that he was working with one of the coaches was they were looking at video footage of a set piece of a corner, and the coach was narrating what was going on and what he wanted his players to look for while they watched the video for the first time. And he thought that was just going to lead to complete cognitive overload, because trying to listen to what you're saying, I'm trying to watch this thing. And so he worked hard on getting them to let them watch the video first, reflect on what they thought they saw as the key points, and only then kind of play it again with narrating it and pausing it and highlighting key parts. I'd expect that might work quite well for teaching as well. I didn't know if you've had any experience of that with teachers, or if not, if you thought that sounded like it would transfer well into the education world.
Yeah, I think so. At Step Lab, we talk about kind of whole part whole modelling, so showing them the whole sequence. And if you're trying to build someone's mental model, like you want them to see cause and effect. And if you keep stopping a video, they're not going to get that sense of cause and effect and build their own mental model. So useful, I think, like perhaps as a heuristic, useful to watch it all the way through, and then to like pause at certain points to like break it down. We like it's all. I also think it's really useful just to have something to hang like you're thinking on the bit in the way that you kind of described earlier. So having like success criteria to look for, things to look for as you watch it through, even that very first time, might be like useful just to contextualize what you're seeing. But yeah, I think useful to have like if it's something that relies on this happens, then this happens, then this happens, some sort of causal sequence, you don't want to be breaking that too early. Otherwise, you're not going to give them what they need.
Perfect. And then last question, and it kind of ties into a bit what we're saying about that in that first paper about receiving feedback, is I hate even hearing myself on a recording. So even if I was to listen to this podcast back with just in my, not even seeing the visuals, but just with my earphones, I hate the sound of my voice. I would imagine for some people, the idea of watching footage of themselves, you have to be fairly vulnerable and also comfortable in your own skin to kind of go, okay, let's watch me together doing this thing. How have you found what works well to get people into a headspace where not only are they okay with that, but they're actually quite enthused by the process of wanting to watch themselves in order to get better? How have you found managing that kind of psychological barrier?
It's so common, isn't it? We all hate it. So we even hate like hearing our voice back, which is just
100%.
never the way you hear it yourself. But so in all honesty, the way that I find, like when people sort of say, oh gosh, I find this so difficult when I've worked with people, it's like immersion therapy. Just like you just need to do it.
Yeah.
You need to do it a lot. But I think it's really useful to watch it with someone at least the first few times, because I think when you watch it just by yourself, you're just so hypercritical. Yeah. And you just point out, God, I can't believe I did that. I can't believe I did that. And you really don't like get very much out of it. But watching it with someone where that other person is kind of distracting you. So as a coach, when I'm watching video of a teacher with them, it will be like, right, so I'm going to show you this clip to make the point that I've just said, that something I noticed, or let's just look for what these students are doing. So try to make it purposeful. So it's not just, we're just watching your teaching back, where they can just focus on themselves and how much they hate the sound of their voice.
Yes, that makes total sense. Well, we tried to cover the topic of professional development in the sense of like, we would try to whittle it down to 3 studies. We probably could have chosen any of like 50 because it's such a big area. But hopefully between those 3, given some food for thought around why sometimes PD might be more successful than others and what some of the mechanisms or principles are. Sarah, honestly, I could listen to you talk about this stuff all day, every day. Sarah, thank you so much for coming on the pod. For all of our lovely listeners, please do let us know your thoughts on those studies, your reflections on professional development, and indeed what topics you'd like us to cover in the future. If you like and subscribe, I will be your best friend forever and ever. Sarah, once again, thank you very much. Everyone else, see you on the next episode. Bye.